January 23rd, 1942. Liverpool, England. The cold, unforgiving rain lashed against the window pane of a small apartment, unnoticed by the figure hunched over a desk inside. The room smelled of tobacco and stale paper, the kind of space where time seems to stretch endlessly, where moments and hours blur into one, leaving only the work behind. The light from a lone lamp flickered like a dying flame, casting shadows over the pages strewn across the desk. It was the kind of setting where most people would have given up, where most minds would have simply yielded to the weight of a world at war. But not Alan Turing. He sat at the desk, his hands moving across the paper, fingers lightly brushing against the ink-stained pages as he scribbled equations. His eyes, intense and focused, darted between a seemingly endless row of numbers and the small chalkboard covered with algorithms. The air in the room was thick with a kind of quiet desperation, yet Turing was not desperate. His mind, sharp as ever, raced at a speed that few could ever comprehend. For all the confusion around him, for all the chaos of war, he was somewhere else entirely, a place few would ever reach. On this particular day, in this dimly lit room, Alan Turing was not just scribbling numbers. He was rewriting the future. The world outside was trembling. The Nazi regime, seemingly unstoppable, had brought the world to the brink of collapse. The war was in full swing, and Britain, standing alone against the Axis powers, was fighting not just for survival, but for its very soul. The enemy's Enigma code, an encryption so complex that even the most brilliant minds couldn't break it, had become the silent barrier between life and death. For the British, the stakes were life and death. The fate of the nation rested on being able to crack the codes, to understand the enemy's next move before it happened. But that was the irony of it all. In the midst of this unprecedented global crisis, the one man who could change everything was sitting in a cramped apartment in Liverpool, unrecognized and overlooked by the very people who needed him most. Turing was an outsider, not just in the social sense, but in every sense that mattered. He didn't come from an aristocratic background. He had no connections to the power structures of the British military or government. He wasn't part of the intellectual elite that frequented Oxford or Cambridge's hallowed halls. Turing's world was quiet, solitary, and filled with books, logic puzzles, and the dissonant hum of machines. His genius was not something that could be easily categorized, not something that could be easily understood by the military men who thought in terms of tanks, bombs, and strategies of war. Turing's brilliance was in something far deeper, an ability to see patterns in chaos, to solve problems that seemed unsolvable. And so, as the British military struggled to keep up with the war, Turing remained a quiet observer, not a soldier in the conventional sense, but someone with a different weapon altogether, his mind. The Enigma code was a puzzle that seemed too complex for human minds. It was designed to be unbreakable, a system so intricate that even the most skilled cryptographers and mathematicians had failed to make any headway. Its structure was layered and shifting, with thousands of combinations changing by the hour. The Germans believed it was the key to keeping their military secrets hidden, and they were right. To crack Enigma was to turn the tide of the war. And yet, no one could figure it out. But Turing was different. He saw things others didn't. Where others saw an insurmountable wall, he saw an opportunity. He began working in isolation, pulling apart the code piece by piece, applying logic and mathematics in ways that others had never imagined. But the military didn't understand him. They didn't understand his methods or his approach. They saw him as an oddity, a strange man who didn't fit into the traditional mold of what a warrior should be. He wasn't out there on a battlefield. He wasn't in uniform, fighting with guns or tanks. His battle was different. It was a battle of the mind. But this was wartime, and the British government had no time for eccentrics. Turing wasn't someone who could easily be fit into a mold. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't a leader. He was a mathematician. Some might say a genius, but still, to the powers that be, he was just another intellectual working on an abstract problem that had no immediate relevance to the war effort. The military needed soldiers who could understand tactics and strategies, not abstract theories and algorithms. They needed results now. The paradox was impossible to ignore. The British military had the best and brightest minds, but their strategies were still failing. They had power, but they lacked the right kind of thinking to match the enemy. It was a problem of vision, a failure to see beyond the traditional boundaries of warfare. They were trapped in an old world, fighting with outdated weapons and strategies. But Alan Turing was thinking beyond those constraints. He was thinking in a language that no one else could yet understand. He was seeing the war through the lens of mathematics, logic, and machines. In his apartment, as the rain fell outside and the world continued its descent into chaos, Turing set out to build something no one else could even imagine, a machine that could crack the Enigma code. It wasn't a physical machine yet. It was more of an idea, a blueprint. He called it the bomb, a machine that would automate the process of code breaking, a tool that would work faster and more efficiently than any human mind could. It was in essence a machine that would think like a human, but at a speed and scale no human could ever achieve. This machine, however, wasn't just a piece of technology. It was a reflection of Turing's mind, a mind that was both deeply human and profoundly ahead of its time. In his thinking, there was no distinction between man and machine. They were two sides of the same coin. If a machine could learn and adapt, if it could think logically, then it could unlock the secrets of the universe, one code at a time. But even as Turing worked tirelessly, he faced an undeniable truth. The military wasn't looking for someone like him. They weren't looking for a man who could build machines that thought. They were looking for soldiers, for warriors, for people who could fight in the traditional sense. Turing's approach was alien to them. The people who would ultimately help him were few and far between. Some, like his mentor, Gordon Welchman, would support his ideas. But others, like the head of British intelligence, would be less inclined to see the value of his work. And so, as the months passed, Turing found himself battling not just the Enigma code, but also the indifference of a military establishment that didn't know how to value his genius. He was stuck in the gap between two worlds, the world of conventional warfare and the world of logic and mathematics. But Turing wasn't one to let such barriers stop him. He kept going, driven by the belief that if he could crack the code, he could help win the war. The clock was ticking. The world was on the brink of collapse. And somewhere, in the silence of his apartment, Alan Turing was building a machine that would change everything. Yet, in the midst of his work, something was beginning to stir, an inner turmoil, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the world would never fully understand him. What good was it to save the world if you couldn't even be seen? What was the point of genius if it was always dismissed, always pushed to the margins? For now, though, those thoughts were secondary. There was work to be done, and Turing knew that the war, the very future of civilization, rested on his ability to finish what he had started. The bomb would come to life, eventually, and the code would crack. But for now, as he sat alone in his dimly lit room, he was a man at the edge of something monumental, yet still invisible to the very world that needed him most. September 4th, 1943. Bletchley Park, England. The air hung thick with the hum of machines and the quiet clatter of typewriters, the steady pulse of a nation's last hope. The estate, a sprawling manor surrounded by an almost unbroken sea of green fields, had been transformed into the heart of Britain's secret war effort. Within its walls, the sharpest minds in the country worked relentlessly, their lives shadowed by secrecy. Here, Alan Turing was no longer the lone genius working in the silence of his apartment in Liverpool. Now he was surrounded by dozens of experts in mathematics, cryptography, and intelligence. Yet still, he was an outsider. When Turing first arrived at Bletchley, he wasn't met with the respect his intelligence demanded. Instead, there was suspicion. He didn't look like the other men working there. He was socially awkward, quiet to the point of seeming aloof, and he had a tendency to speak in a way that made people uneasy. He didn't have the traditional background that most of the brilliant minds at Bletchley possessed. He hadn't attended the grand universities like Oxford or Cambridge, and he didn't come from an aristocratic family. To them, he seemed more like a strange figure, a peculiar man with ideas that seemed detached from the world of real warfare. But beneath the exterior, there was a mind so powerful that it would shape the course of the war in ways no one could yet comprehend. Alan Turing's mind was not one of simple logic or conventional thinking. He was a man who could understand patterns where others saw chaos. He was someone who didn't look at the war in the same way as the military men or intelligence officers around him. They were accustomed to planning battles and strategies, focused on the movements of armies and the deployment of soldiers. Turing, however, saw the war as a puzzle, a massive, intricate puzzle where each piece could be decoded if only the right method could be found. And to him, the Enigma code was the ultimate riddle, a code so complex that even the best cryptographers had been unable to break it. But Turing was different. He didn't believe in the limits others placed on what was possible. He threw himself into the challenge of breaking Enigma with a passion and intensity that no one at Bletchley had ever seen. But he did it in his own way. Where others relied on traditional methods, manual computation, paper, and pencil, Turing saw something entirely different. He believed in the power of machines. Machines he thought could think. They could follow the rules of logic and mathematics. And most importantly, they could work faster and more efficiently than any human could. His vision was nothing short of revolutionary. To create a machine capable of decrypting the Enigma messages in hours instead of days, and to do it without human error. He called it the bomb, a machine that would automate the process of breaking the German code. At its heart, the bomb was a mechanical marvel, a set of rotating drums and electrical circuits designed to simulate the work of a human cryptanalyst, but at a speed and scale no human mind could ever match. It was a piece of technology that seemed to exist in a world of its own, far beyond anything the military had seen before. But as Turing began to sketch out his ideas, he quickly realized that not everyone shared his enthusiasm for machines. There were many who believed that a solution as abstract as a machine was far too radical. The British military, steeped in tradition, could not see the value of a machine that could think, let alone one that could change the tide of the war. And yet, despite the skepticism surrounding him, Turing pushed forward. His machine, in its early stages, was rudimentary, a far cry from the polished, functional bomb that would later become the key to cracking Enigma. But Turing wasn't concerned with the doubts of others. He wasn't interested in fitting into the mold of what they thought a genius should look like. He simply wanted to win the war. In his mind, the bomb was not just a machine. It was the future. But as Turing worked, he was confronted with more than just technical challenges. There was the emotional isolation of being at Bletchley, a place that, for all its brilliance, was also a hive of egos and ambition. There were men and women at Bletchley who knew their worth, who expected to be recognized for their efforts, their intelligence. But Turing wasn't interested in accolades. He wasn't motivated by fame or glory. His was a quieter kind of brilliance, the kind that took shape behind closed doors, far away from the limelight. Yet, in a place like Bletchley, that kind of humility often went unnoticed. It wasn't that Turing was unappreciated, though many certainly didn't understand him, but there was a profound disconnect between his mind and the world around him. Turing didn't think the way others did. Where they were concerned with strategy, intelligence, and the human face of war, he was concerned with one thing: the code. The Enigma machine was an enigma not only to the Germans but to the entire world. It was the key to the future of the war, and Turing's mind alone could see how to unlock it. But no one, least of all the higher-ups at Bletchley, truly understood the significance of what he was doing. They weren't just uninterested, they were actively skeptical. After all, the bomb was an idea, not a tangible solution. The military didn't have time for ideas, they needed results. Turing, however, didn't let the lack of recognition deter him. He understood that his job was not to please the powers that be. His task was far more important. He was on the verge of creating something that would not only change the war, but would change history. But in the meantime, he was forced to deal with the slow pace of progress. The bomb was no simple invention. It required precision. Every drum, every wire, every electrical pulse had to be calibrated perfectly. It was a painstaking process, and as Turing worked, the hours blurred into days. The strain of working under constant pressure, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance, took its toll on him. He wasn't just fighting the Nazis. He was fighting against time, against an unforgiving system, and perhaps most painfully, against the very people who should have been his greatest allies. Despite all of this, Turing's machine began to take shape. Slowly but surely, it became clear that the bomb was not just a theoretical concept. It was real. It could work. And as it began to show promise, Turing's world began to shift. The men and women at Bletchley began to see the value in what he had created. Yet, it was never a straightforward path. Turing was still an outsider. Even when his bomb began working, even when it began cracking the Enigma code, he wasn't immediately celebrated. There was still skepticism, still resistance to the idea that a machine could achieve what human beings could not. The military establishment, entrenched in their own ways, could not bring themselves to fully embrace the radical nature of what Turing had accomplished. Still, Turing continued undeterred. As the bomb worked, the impact of his invention rippled through the intelligence community. Messages once thought indecipherable were now within reach. And with each new breakthrough, the puzzle of Enigma came closer to being solved. But the deeper Turing delved into the code, the more he realized the contradictions of his situation. He was the one who had brought the bomb to life. He was the one who had cracked the code. But his genius, even as it turned the tide of war, was still largely unrecognized. The admiration he deserved remained out of reach. There was no fanfare, no parade, no medals. There was only the cold, quiet satisfaction of knowing that his work was helping to shorten the war and save lives. But at what cost? Turing would always be an outsider, always be the man who had succeeded where others failed, but never fully appreciated for it. As Turing stood at the center of this monumental shift in history, he knew that the war was far from over, and so was his work. But the question remained, would anyone ever fully understand what he had done? Or would he remain forever on the outside, a genius forgotten by a world that couldn't and wouldn't see him for who he truly was? April 12, 1952. Manchester, England. The quiet hum of the city seemed almost out of place, as though it were trying to mask the storm that had been brewing within Alan Turing for years. The streets outside were lined with gray, imposing buildings that spoke of industry and progress. But inside his modest home, there was only silence, silent reflection, silent grief, silent loneliness. Turing had spent years breaking codes, reprogramming history, and yet here, in the quiet of his own mind, the most devastating code he had ever encountered was the one he couldn't crack: how to find peace in a world that never quite understood him. Turing's contribution to the war had been monumental. His creation of the bomb, the machine that could break the Nazi Enigma code, had altered the course of history. It had saved countless lives and shortened the war by years. His genius had unlocked the future of cryptography, his machine changing the face of modern warfare forever. But the accolades, the recognition, none of that came in the way it should have. What Turing received instead was a far different kind of treatment, one rooted in the prejudices and the moral blind spots of the time.